Welcome back to another reading and correcting with me, Kindar, the Tiger Writes, and Ty, the Tiger Supervisor. These are where I read a chapter from one of my stories and correct it as I go. If you want to listen to these live, it's every Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. Eastern Time on Twitch, and if you're looking to support me, that is on my Patreon. Today we are doing chapter 44 of Breaking Step. Tibs smirked as another noble lobbed a silver plate in the air. In this air? Why, is there other air around? In the air. This time he hit it with a series of ice shard, spinning it and keeping it in the air until he etched a blob of sticking water that stuck it to the wall, then slowly slid down. Out the corner of his eyes, Lamberto motioned to him, and stifling a sigh, Tibbs bowed to the hoes and ahs of those watching. There was a lot of light on those, but some were honest about being impressed. Gabrielle handed him another goblet of dark liquid, she and the young nobles around her. Gabrielle handed him another goblet of the dark liquid. Okay. She and the young nobles around her, her friends, he guessed, were drinking. He pulled the corruption out, then made a cap of purity over it so that as he drank it, it was nothing more than flavored water. What she handed him was no different in essence than what she drank, but now was not the time to be drunk. It wouldn't take much to tell them exactly what he thought of their kind if he wasn't completely in control of himself. He raised the goblet once he downed it, and louder applause ensued. It was like they considered his ability to outdrink them more impressive than what he did with essence. He decided against throwing the goblet at the table and seeing if he could etch water there fast enough to catch it. They didn't seem to mind when he broke something as part of the test they put him through, but they'd complain if it happened unprompted. That was amazing, Lamberto said, following Tibbs to a table with food. Each time he went to one of them, someone there pointed to one of the small portion and expressed amazement at one thing or another, or they commented about the artisanal skill of the servants in arranging the table in such an appealing manner. The way some went on about how this color went so well with that dish, or the sheen of the plating, sounded to Tibbs more like they were trying to impress than convey anything of use. Tibbs just wished the food was plated as meals instead of things he needed to pick with his fingers. He was hungry, but no one did more than take the occasional morsel on display. It was all It all tasted good, and Tibbs told the servant as much. As much. He simply didn't feel like he could fill himself without the noble looking at him askance. It shouldn't matter. It shouldn't matter. He didn't care what nobles thought of him. Tell me, the noble looked Tibbs over, stopping him from grabbing a second piece of food. Young man, I've watched you throw ice around, but can you do something about this? He presented the crystal goblet containing an almost clear liquid. Our host can't seem to keep his drinks cold. The goblet was filled with a mix of essence Tibbs was familiar with from all the alcohol he'd sensed at the inn and here. This was concentrated enough, it had to be a potent drink. Of course he can, Lamberto said enthusiastically. There's nothing Tibbs can't do with his element. Isn't that right? Tibbs wished the boy would just stop. Couldn't work out what his game was, but it had to be more than making himself more important. It had to be more than making himself more important. More than making himself important by latching onto Tibbs. Did he think Tibbs held him in higher esteem for spreading his fame? The choice taken away from him, Tibbs touched the goblet and formed pieces of ice in the liquid until a few were left floating. The man sipped the content, sighed in appreciation, and walked away without so much as a thank you. Gratitude was beneath these such people. Tibbs looked over the crowd while chewing on a piece of bread crust coated with a thin layer of meaty and spicy paste. Nobles pointed at him while talking with those around them. Smiles were exchanged, chuckles, when they no longer looked at him. He could find out what they said. No one here had the air as their element, so he could be noticed, but he didn't care what they had to say. He was surprised at how many of them were armed beyond the usual knife. Everyone carried, and many had an extra in their boots or hidden at their back or in bracers the way he had one in his. A woman even had a metal needle in her hair, masquerading as those that held her braid in place but were made of wood. A few had swords at their hips that lacked the decoration Tibbs saw on some on those nobles simply looking to impress. Oh, simply saw those nobles simply looking to impress. Carried. Oh, I see where. I see where the on came from. So on those nobles simply looking to impress carried. Beyond the weapons themselves, some had the knives scabbard. Beyond the weapons themselves, some had their knives scabbard filled with a liquid thick with corruption. It reminded him that one of the items on his ever-growing list was finding a way to get his hand on varying poisons so he could learn to recognize them by the composition of their essence. He also wanted to test if removing the corruption was all it took to make them harmless. He suspected not. Even without corruption, alcohol could affect his judgment if he drank too much of it. You, a woman called from the crowd, and Tibbs felt the metal spoon she threw. He turned, and with a flick of the finger, water lanced at the silver spoon from the floor. Lanced from the floor. At the silver spoon before it hit him. He let it float there as the water formed a sphere around it, then plucked it out and placed it on the table. Not as much applause this time. Come on, Lombardo whispered. Stifling another sigh, Tibbs bowed, and the applause increased. Nobles and their stupid customs. He watched servants enter, carrying trays, as he ate a piece of crustless bread coated with a sweet and sour jam. Maybe now he'd get to have. Nope, only more platters with tiny breads to replace the empty ones. Our servant caught his attention as he reached for one with slices of meat and cheese on it. You know what? Thin slices of meat and cheese on it. It wasn't the darkness in her. She had more than the other servant, but compared to everyone else, and secrets didn't mean bad intentions. It was how attentive she was to the room instead of those before the table. She was discreet, but Tibbs knew the work of a rogue, or a thief in this case. She had no essence, and he didn't recognize her from any of the runners. Her presence annoyed him. It meant he'd get blamed for whatever she'd do. He'd have to deal with the commander again when the nobles complained. He might spend time in the cell again, and Irgian would make sure it was on the day before his team's run. He needed to increase measures to catch any thief that made it past the guards. Maybe if he explained his role to them, they wouldn't make his life too difficult. He let her be, returning to eating something from a different plate, a red slice of some vegetable with cheese on it. This time, maybe she was good enough, her target wouldn't realize they'd been robbed. You need to meet Lord Martin, Lamberto said eagerly, and Tibbs nodded. Again, the boy parroted him before other nobles, explaining who Tibbs was, his element, then offered the men. Oh, another noble. Okay, this is parroting him. his, his element, then offered for the men to test him. The noble acted impressed. He didn't voice it, so Tibbs couldn't tell how honest it was, but the man had to have seen Tibbs's previous demonstration. He expected that, as the host's son, Lamberto was due the same reverence as his father, and the boy seemed intent on taking full advantage of it. A noble threw another plate. Tibbs caught it, and the woman politely clapped before engaging Lamberto in conversation. Uh, Before the in conversation, something about his plan for after Tibbs was far enough not to hear the rest. He was glad to be away from the boy, finally, and the food table called to him. I must admit, this is one of Theodore's better event. A man with his back to Tibbs said once he was next to the table. I agree. The woman with him said, our attention on the food. I can't recall the last time I was this entertained. The man has always been clever. For him to turn these problems at home into an opportunity, well, that's just like him. Where else could he get such entertainment for nothing more than saying he'd buy a home and have his children live here? He had to, regardless. So someone was taking advantage of the guild? Good, even if it was a noble. You can always count on Theodore to pull one over those who think themselves better, the woman said. As you'd well know, the man replied smugly. Yes, well, unlike others, I've learned my lesson. She replied unconcerned. Did you see the boy? Oh, yes. Throwing water and ice. So impressive. The man chuckled mockingly. And how he preened afterward? She added, as if that made him more than some dirt-born child. Ice covered the piece of bread in his hand. What they thought didn't matter, he told himself as the ice inside him cracked. Realization of what he'd done didn't hit as hard as he knew it should. Ice did that to him. He thought it carefully, maintaining control of the rising anger underneath. Rising anger underneath. Of course they laughed at him. They were nobles. What else would they do? He wasn't here looking for approval from them or anything. This was a duty forced on him by Tyrannia, and, as it turned out, one that wasn't needed. If Tyrannia had been more clever, she would have known this noble had no choice but to agree to anything she wanted, instead of her bowing to him. Then why was he so abyss angry? This was how he expected them to treat him. Because, he realized, it had been nice to be seen by people like them, to be acknowledged as something more than dirt. He didn't want to be seen as anything close to them, but he had seen respect at what he could do, hadn't he? Light didn't shine on action, so he had no way to know how true those looks had been, but he knew they were nobles. It hadn't been honest. It probably hadn't even been respect. He'd seen what he wanted to see while they mocked him silently, smirking at every performance he put on for them. Tibbs, Lamberto said, come, you have to speak with Lady Trefraine. No, Tibbs snarled. The boy was the reason. I don't have to do one cursed thing you say. The boy had heard some abyss cursed bard and decided Tibbs was I decided on Tibbs as his way to make himself better. Tibbs, I'm sorry, but what? Fucking stop! Antagonizing anyone in the room was a bad idea, but he was done taking this noble's condescension. I know what you're doing with prancing me around like I'm your pet runner. I'm not sure you aren't, he snorted. I know dogs who are treated better than you're treating me. Tibbs walked away. Tibbs, Lamberto called and caught up with him. What happened? Let me help you. You happened. He rounded on the boy. Everyone was paying attention to them, but Tibbs didn't care. He was only here because Tyrannia bought the noble's con. You and you're clinging to me. You're using me to make yourself more important than to them. I'm done. I'm leaving and you can't. The glint of metal pulled his attention, not because the woman on the other side of the room held it or that it was a knife, but because, before he sensed it, the metal essence hadn't been there at all. It hadn't been. It hadn't been gathered to make the knife. It had appeared. He was already shoving Noble out of his way before he was done processing the information. He ignored their protest, focused on the metal, and he thought he sensed darkness woven through it. The fact he couldn't be sure of what he was sensing confirmed how the knife had been hidden, a weave of darkness. He tackled the man the knife stuck. As the knife struck, felt it planted in his stomach, leaving behind corruption as she pulled it out. He absorbed the essence as "Watch where you're going," the young noble protested. "You made me spill my drink." He elbowed Paladin to push him out of reach of the would-be assassin. He formed a shield and blocked her next strike, aimed for Lamberto's brother. He kicked her. Ignoring the ongoing complaints from the man, forcing her to back away. She was the servant he noticed earlier. He formed his sword and the crowd awed. They were watching? Oh, of course they were. They'd even moved back enough to let the fight happen without putting them at risk. They wanted a show. He considered leaving. They knew about the assassin. Let them deal with her. They'd complain he hadn't done his duty and protected them. Tyrannia would be angry at him, more when he explained she'd been played. She might even question if he was really on her side. Those were good reasons not to leave. Tibs grinned at her. They were not why he remained, why he stayed. His reason was simpler. He wanted to hit someone. He had anger to spend, and she was someone who couldn't bitch afterward at being the target. She swung, he blocked, she dodged his swing. The knife meant she needed to get close, but she was nimble. He had ice under her feet and swung as she fell, but she rolled out of the way, then was back on her feet before he could adjust his attack. Then she had back on her feet. Then she was under his sword. The knife sliced his doublet open, and he absorbed the corruption the tip left in his flesh. She looked perturbed that he was still standing, but Stib was getting pissed. He had elements, and she didn't. She shouldn't be able to get in cuts after cuts while he hardly managed to touch her. He should have won already. In the back of his mind, Cross laughed. When she stepped in the water, her foot stuck. He got in one slice that left her a thin red line along her stomach. Then she'd rolled back her foot out of her boot. She attacked again before he had a response ready, and he parried, trying to use the spike on his sword to disarm her, or cut her arm, but the knife darted in and out as if she could bend around them. He stepped back. This had gone on long enough. He etched the next attack and only put enough essence in to incapacitate her. The table shattered as she jumped out of the way. He fought through the astonishment and flung a knife shard, but she deflected it with her knife. Then she smirked as he stared. He blocked her attack with his shield, but even as he grew the spikes, she jumped over it and him. He turned to follow and close the distance as she stumbled. Even as he swung, he realized there were no reasons for her to have stumbled. Nothing on the floor, no essence in her path. It was a ruse. He readied himself for whatever she might do, unable to stop his swing as someone yelled his name. He landed on the floor, unable to tell where the attack had come from. Lamberto stood where he'd been, a man, another servant, pulling a knife out of the young noble's stomach. Tibs threw his sword, and it impaled itself in the man's chest. Then he was up, another sword forming, ready to finish this. "It hurts!" Lamberto whined, hand over his bloody stomach as nobles ran for the exit. "It hurts!" Tibbs nearly ran with them. The other assassin was hiding among them, escaping. He needed to get eyes on her because her essence was already lost in the crowd, but Lamberto let out a pained moan as he fell. Why the fuck did you do that? Tibbs demanded as he knelt next to him. He couldn't do much without someone asking a question, but he wasn't letting him die. Fortunately, Lamberto wasn't losing a lot of essence, and no one could sense him removing as much of the corruption as he could. What had already seeped into his essence was out of his reach. I couldn't let you be killed. He looked away as Tibbs sliced the shirt open. How bad is it? Tibbs stared as something glittered in the blood. Cursor, where's my cursor? Glittered in the blood. Is that bad? Umberto asked, staring at his bloody stomach. Tibbs wiped the white blood away to reveal crystal filling the wound, keeping Lamberto from bleeding out. How did you do that? Gabriel asked as her siblings joined them. Tibbs smiled at the confused expression Lamberto gave her. Maybe there was one person in that bunch that wasn't doomed to feed still after all. That concludes chapter 44 of Breaking Step. If you are enjoying this, please leave a like. If you want to know when the next chapter is going to be up, subscribe and hit the bell. If you want to read the story, it is up for free on Royal Road. If you want to read ahead of that, you can do that by supporting me on my Patreon. And if you want to listen to these live, it's every Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. on Twitch. The links are in the note. And with that, I shall wish you a good day.